Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. If you are listening on the podcast, you will notice that there's some background noise. Today, we are recording from New Orleans, the town that is trying to recover perpetually from Mardi Gras. I have never been, but yeah, there's still remnants of, we're out here traveling, and there's still remnants of Mardi Gras to be found in the gutters, I guess. It happened a couple weeks before we got here. But thank you for listening. The microphone that I'm using is going to sound a little bit different. It was sent to us by one of you listeners, and so I'm not going to dox you. Thank you very much. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice the background is a bit different. We are enjoying the weather on what you might call a vacation. It's probably not. But the topic of today's Culture Cast, the topic of today's Redacted Culture Cast, is the rising kind of uncomfortable question of who is allowed in gun culture, or maybe who is gun culture for. And I'm going to draw on a couple of conversations that we've had in the past, but then also I think this is an example where framing the question, the framing of the question actually attempts to answer it itself. It's a good question to ask, but it's a good question to ask because it also helps us consider how we think about other things like authority, community, participation, tribes, so on and so forth. But yes, the question of the day is who is allowed and who is or is not allowed in gun culture. Before we get started, while this is happening, we do have a skate deck that is available for pre-order in conjunction with Orion Training Group, and the proceeds of which are going to the Firearms Policy Coalition, who at this time is still putting together an aggressive and encouraging push against the brace ruling. We're really hoping that as a result of the ATFs overstepping their bounds, we see things like SBRs get taken off of the NFA list. That being the case, that pre-order is available on the day that this is going live. It'll be available for another week in the beginning of March. It's a pre-order. We'll deliver those later in March as soon as they get shipped over. Should be able to see a couple versions of it, or not a couple versions. We're going to have our own one in hand here pretty soon. We're definitely looking forward to it. That's us, Orion Training Group, made by Raid Skateboards, and we're looking forward to that. So right into the topic. Let's get into the meat and potatoes. The question of who is allowed in gun culture was kind of brought to the attention or brought to the forefront of this sort of social sphere when admin results got doxed. I think that was the most recent event which brought this question into sort of the into the chat, as you say. And like many things that we engage with, how we answer the question is oftentimes or how we answer the question will be constrained by how we frame the question, and how we frame the question oftentimes reveals more about what we think are our assumptions than actually answering the question does. An example of this and how that works within this question of who is available in, or who is allowed in gun culture and who is not, can be, it sort of reveals itself by even asking the question. If I can ask the question of who is allowed into gun culture and who is not, I must begin with the assumption that it is a thing. It is maybe it's an abstract object. It's a club of sorts which has a roster. It has an in-group versus out-group potential or possibility. Is that true or is that not true is kind of the first question. So how we begin to answer, how I think we should answer the question of who is or is not allowed in gun culture will be a little bit, I think the best way we can answer that question is by considering how we describe the thing, how we describe it, not prescribe it. Describing it is, there's another healthy distinction to keep in your pocketbook, and that is the distinction between a prescription and a description. It's sort of similar between correlation and causation, but it's not as cringy. It's a little bit more specific. And the difference between a description and a prescription in this case, or not in this case, but in another example, would be what people refer to as sort of like profiling or making observations about the world. When I see something, let's just say, what is it like? Red cars of the cars that were pulled over in 2020 that were speeding in egregious speeds, 25% of them were red. But all the other colors that were available, or maybe let's just say 50% of cars that were pulled over when speeding were red. For speeding, over 100 miles an hour. Let me rephrase the question. This is all hypothetical information, but as an example, in a metaphor, in the year 2020, 50% of the cars that were pulled over and the drivers arrested for speeding over 100 miles an hour were red. Of the remaining 50%, it was an even non-valuable, dispersion between the other colors, but 50% of the cars were red. Now, in a descriptive sense, I would say that of the cars that were pulled over, 50% of them were red, and that is describing a fact that happens. It's describing the fact that there were so many cars that did that were pulled over for speeding over 100 miles an hour. 50% of them were red. A prescriptive thing would say something like it was because they were red that they were speeding. A prescriptive sense claims that one of the important use of the distinction between a prescription and a description is oftentimes can look like in profiling is that we're going to go back to the cars here. 50% of cars that are pulled over for speeding are red. That's descriptive. And so in other words, the things that the cars that were pulled over because they were speeding, not because they were red. However, a prescriptive assumption would say that there's something about them being red has to do with them being pulled over. And it might be because red cars are more attractive to people who like to speed, or because red is more easy to notice, or because the eye quickly sees red. It's got a certain notion to it. But what we're doing is we're distinguishing between prescription, which is saying there's something about being red that makes the car go fast, versus description is of the cars that are pulled over, a certain percentage of them are red. Maybe a majority of them are red or something. So it's a distinction that's important, especially when you look at like human profiling or threat, determining threats is like, well, people who dress a certain way tend to be, or of the people who commit a certain crime, they tend to dress a certain way. Is it the way that they dress that makes them commit the crime? That would be a prescription. Whereas there's a correlation between certain social factors and certain crimes, and that's just how you'd have to describe it. So this has to go back to gun culture, and why are we asking the question of who is and isn't allowed into gun culture? I think the first thing that everyone within gun culture can say, I think most of us will say, is that the only way that we have to answer this question is non-authoritarian. That means that there is no council, there is no group of people who get to determine who is or is not in gun culture. And this begins to point out a problem that we have with allowing our questions to be framed by people who don't hold the same values as us. The very idea that some group of people who could come together and determine who is and is not in gun culture, does not have access to the Second Amendment, is by definition antithetical to this idea that we believe in, which is the right to bear arms. In other words, and I need to be very clear on it, gun culture is separate from the Second Amendment. What we're referring to as gun culture is what we refer to as gun culture, separate to the Second Amendment. Does somebody have a right to have a position or a participation within gun culture? And maybe that answer is no. But being a part of gun culture is different than having access to the Second Amendment, or not access is not the right even word, having the right to bear arms. You see where I hope I'm exploring this in a clear enough way to communicate a little bit on how the question itself could itself be the problem. If we ask ourselves the question, who is or is not in gun culture, what are we referring to first? Are we referring to, is gun culture the same thing as the right to bear arms? We would naturally say No. And because of that, we can say, and because of that, though, we want to look at the virtue of the, not the virtue, but we want to, a principle within the Second Amendment is human right. Do you have a right? Is that same right applied to gun culture? Sometimes we might say the answer is yes. We might say the answer is no. That's how we want to answer that question. So moving on, I'll let the bus drive by for something adventures go swan. Okay, we're gonna let that pass. At least the people playing the loud music haven't come down the road yet. So, but yeah. So the first question, let's go back to, coming back to the start. First question is, what do we mean by who is and is not allowed in gun culture? Gun culture is distinct from the Second Amendment. We can make that clear. 2, what is gun culture? Is it a community? Is it a club? Is it a tribe? Is it a fashion sense? Is it a trend? Is it a, what are we referring to? Is it a culture? Is it like, the Roman culture? Is it like Americana culture? I think that you could make an argument that gun culture, America has a unique approach to gun culture, semi-unique, but it has a very assertive approach to it, being it is enshrined in our Constitution, but that's not the same thing. The Constitution does not guarantee the success and health of the gun culture. It just tries to argue that the right to bear arms will not be infringed. And then, well, if the people don't care, then they do it anyway, which is kind of where we're at. Great, thanks. But this then goes, how do we describe gun culture? And I tend to think that gun culture exists in a sense of tribes, circles, groups of people, communities, neighborhoods, families, friendships, community interests that have overlap with others. We have kind of the big tent of gun culture itself. And then inside that tent, you have multiple little camps. It's similar to kind of how evangelical or Protestant theology, Protestant Christianity has different denominations inside, and yeah, sure, there's conflicts between those two, but generally speaking, it's this is a descriptor, not a prescriptor again. So the big tent of gun culture incorporates many of these people, many of these different groups, and some of those groups are overt. They are organizations like the NRA. The NRA is a tent within a tent. There's a whole group of people who are members of the NRA. Now, who does the NRA allow into their tent and who does the NRA not allow into their tent is sort of the rules of the NRA. They get to make their decisions. There are other examples of them. Some of them are overt, some of them are not. An overt example of a tent within the tents of gun culture, or a community within the communities of gun culture, is veterans. There is a certain status of there's a status of being a veteran, as in it's a statement, a person is a veteran, and really only veterans are in veteran-only groups. Okay, so these ways are being described. We know that veterans don't have control over gun culture. We know that the NRA doesn't have a monopoly over gun culture. We know that the Firearms Policy Coalition doesn't have a monopoly over gun culture. We know that Garand Thumb's influence is not a monopoly over it. We have all of these different things going on, and we have all these individuals participating within gun culture. And so the first thing we might run into is sort of the vanity of the question of who is or is not allowed into gun culture. And part of that vanity really does come on, not vanity, but part of that where that starts to look like it's in vain is a recognition that there really is no single factor, that measurable trait factor or whatever, that determines who is or is not in gun culture. Because if you have a group that, say, is exclusionary, you can just as easily start a group that is the opposite of that exclusionary. Why we haven't seen civilian only organizations in the past is I don't know, but I mean, it wouldn't be beyond the possibility. And then of course the wind picks up. This is great. I hope you can hear me well enough. This Shure M7 is working pretty great. It's too bad that it can't transform into an MP7, but that might be illegal where I'm at. So sticking to the subject material, sticking back to the question, we have one, there's a distinction between the Second Amendment and gun culture. 2, gun culture itself is a broad tent. Inside of that tent are many camps. Some of those camps have overlap. Some of them are overtly exclusive, and some of them are covertly or less overtly exclusive. Some of them are not exclusive at all, but people just choose not to join, and that's just kind of the way of it. Did they send a helicopter after me? Is finance and maneuver in? We'll let it go. We'll let that one go. So that being the case, those are two things that we've determined. The third one, and the third question then, is that one is we look at the principles and the values that we're trying to understand. Now, I am going to say that I think that there are certain values that people within gun culture hold. They are not the only people who hold those values, but there are certain values that are distinctly apparent within gun culture, and one of them might be individual responsibility. So gun culture, any form of gun culture or any subgroup of gun culture which fundamentally denies this idea or opposes this idea that the individual has a right to bear arms and yet is opposed to them being responsible for their actions. I'm not talking about legal responsibility. I'm not talking about, foolish activism like, a person who defends their life should be held liable for the thing that they did. It's this kind of garbagey argument. I'm saying that we all agree, generally speaking, within gun culture, that a person who is in gun culture should exhibit certain character traits. One of them is individual responsibility. Another one is, non-authoritarianism is another example. But I think what we can start to say is that I think we can start to say that there are factors which will make people be excluded from elements of gun culture. We actually already see this happening. We've already seen this happen before. And I think instead of it being more of an authoritarian approach, that there's somebody or some group of people who get to determine who is or is not in the group, rather, since there is no authority that gets to say who is or isn't within gun culture, rather gun culture broad, and then even then distinct from the Second Amendment itself. Inside gun culture, there are camps. What that fundamentally boils down to is that we as individuals have a responsibility to pay attention to who we affiliate with. Who are our people? Who is our camp within a camp? Who is our tent within a tent? Who is don't take that out of context. Who are the people that we deliberately spend our time with? If we pay attention to who we spend our time with, that we have, if we pay attention, if we are deliberate about who we spend our time with, if we are responsible to our friends, if we commit ourselves to our community, we can hold, we actually do hold each other accountable very well. We see this quite clearly. For example, stolen valor. Anytime that somebody gets caught stealing valor, as it's called, usually that usually is a death sentence of their influence within gun culture. And maybe we need a road to redemption, and maybe we need a path of, a way of like figuring out some sort of non-authoritarian way of how people can come back to good graces. And that's a question for another time. But how gun culture treats things like stolen valor is actually highlights a question of who we automatically keep out of gun culture, and that would be people who do not have integrity. Now, integrity is not easily measurable. It sometimes is a thing that it when you see it, its absence when you see its absence. And there is a little bit of mud to be thrown back and forth between who does and doesn't have integrity. We like to use words like shill. We like to use words like, greed and corporate and blah, 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 blah. But what all of this points to is that we actually already have certain values that we hold, generally speaking, within gun culture, that inform individuals, as opposed to gun culture as a whole, about who they do and do not affiliate with, and who they do and do not kind of allow into their life, into their influence, and that, I think, that is the best way that we can look at it. And this is when we ask the question, who is or is not allowed in gun culture? What we should be asking is, we should be asking ourselves, who is it that I allow to influence me and why? And who is it, or what virtues or the betrayal of virtues have I seen in certain people that that have caused me, or that I by which I have chosen to keep them outside of my influence? And that's kind of where I think that's where we take, you know, this principle within both gun culture and that is represented in the Second Amendment, and we take it and we boil it back down to this idea of the individual has a right. Attached to that right is a responsibility. There's a sense of obligation involved. Because I am, or no, it's not because, but in conjunction with having a right to bear arms, I am responsible for what I do with those arms. I have a right to be in a culture, maybe, probably not, but this is kind of where that distinction comes up. But how I exist within gun culture, which might actually just be my culture, it does necessarily include the overt or implied question of who are my people. And sometimes we can say my people are our fellow Americans. That's an easy example. Sometimes we say it is the people within my neighborhood. Sometimes it's the people on my shooting team. Sometimes it's the people in my club. Sometimes it's the people in my, insert the word that you want here. And so when we encounter people in our businesses, in our communities, in our cultures, gun culture being an odd fusion of culture and corporation, I mean, culture and industry, I guess, which isn't really that odd. It's actually quite normal. But when we look at gun culture, we may not be able to say things like that person has no place here by my authority, but we can say that I will not be affiliating with them. I will not be participating with them. I'm just going to kind of let it go. And I think that is the best. I think that is the best start to how we answer that question. I think the best start to how we answer the question of who we allow in or not in gun culture is who are the people that we spend our time with, we spend our community with, we build our, you know, who are we trying to help and make their lives better? And people who exhibit traits like, if he is dishonest, then no, you are not required to affiliate with a person who is dishonest. Now, don't dishonestly determine that people are dishonest. It kind of builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. But we are not entitled. There is no entitlement to participation in gun culture. There's no entitlement to be here. But so that we don't have an entitlement to be within gun culture. You have an entitlement to the right to bear arms, but you don't. And even that being the case, there is no one party or person who determines who is or is not in gun culture. And so a warning would be, don't blame gun culture as a whole for you not having a community within a community. Maybe the answer is you have to go build one. And if you don't have a place here, I guarantee you, if you don't feel like you have a place within gun culture, you might need to ask yourself, is it a character trait that you're exhibiting? And again, like a really easy example is like, you know, again, stolen valor is a really good one. If you are caught committing stolen valor, then you should not be surprised, and you should, when you are not welcome into veteran and gun culture communities. Does this happen very often? No, but usually when it does, it's very spectacularly. Next, when we are looking at our communities, instead of only looking at gun culture as a whole, we can also look at how we have our own communities and our own smaller circles as sort of participants in the body of a whole. Sure, we all want to come together, and yes, gun culture can be very tribal, and perhaps how we interact as tribes needs a little bit of inspection. Maybe you shouldn't build your identity on being a dick. Some people do that. I don't know why. But you know, those kind of things tend to weed them out. There is this rule of the jungle of if you are just you know, that guy, you tend to not stick around. And the if you look in the long line of history, flash in the pan participants who build their only position on false clout or false, whatever, tend to fade rather quickly and be forgotten by history. So with that being the case, in conclusion, closing in this beautiful day in New Orleans, which we'll be back on the normal grind next week. What we've tried to do here is talk about this question of who is or is not allowed in gun culture. And I think the answer is, who are your friends? If you don't choose them, they'll be chosen for you. Probably not the way we want it to work out. We want to have some deliberation over who we allow to have influence over our lives. And instead of making an authoritative statement about who other people should allow, maybe we should pay attention to ourselves first. That being said, if you're a liar, if you betray, if you, and now we get a correlation and causation, or we get prescription and description between, like, are all socialists liars? And you could go down that rabbit hole another time. But rather, when we, or in conclusion, instead of asking, and I've found this myself, instead of trying to sit here and go, who do I think should or should not be within gun culture, perhaps I should be asking myself the question of, who do I allow to have influence over me and who do I not? And I don't mean influence in like the influencer way. I mean, like, who, like, how do I deliberately think about, my circle? And I think that's where we start, is that instead of trying to fix gun culture as a whole, we start with our decentralized approach. That being the case, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. I thank you for listening. I hope that this episode is a bit of a breath of fresh air, as we're kind of on vacation, which is supposed to be a breath of fresh air. If you are still listening and you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. That's where you get the first looks for anything that we're coming out with. And also, if you want to support the show financially through there, we do have a subscription model. It's really just to keep the show rolling. I really do appreciate those who have jumped on. Thank you very much. In addition to that, skate decks are still live. If you want to make a pre-order, you got a couple more days to do it. We want to knock that out. That's been going great. Thank you so much for what you've done so far. And then finally, leave a comment below. See what you got, and we'll talk to you soon. With that being said, we're signing off for the day.